Well, y'all, thank you so much for joining us here for our first installation of this new Bible study that we are hosting at Second Presbyterian Church. Our study is entitled Isaiah's Light in the Darkness, Faith When Hope Feels Heavy. We are so excited that you have decided to join us here today. My name is Reverend Chris Palmer, and I'm one of the Lake Fellows here at Second Presbyterian.
And my name is Katherine Ellis. Thank you so much for having us.
And so this is the first of our 8 studies that will take us through the book of Isaiah. And the first study, a good place to begin, is on Isaiah's call narrative, Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Let's break this text open.
I'm going to read it for us first. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were there in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet. And with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me.
Well, Katherine, I think the first thing that strikes me about this passage, at least, is how often we use it in the liturgical life of the church. You think of that refrain, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord. How often that greets us at Christmas time. Or how this text is often read, who shall I send? And then Isaiah raises up his hand and says, Here I am, send me. How often that is read at the ordination of our pastors. And this passage is so rich with meaning, but what strikes you about it right off the bat?
I think I'm just so struck by the scene. We kind of immediately know that we're not in any sort of earthly, normal, kind of kingly room. We are met with this description of the Lord enthroned, with his robe extending to the different corners of the room, the temple. So I think I'm just really struck by the fact that this is a heavenly scene, that we are sort of in a different kind of place.
Absolutely, we're in a different realm. In some ways, this scene is both similar and very different from other call narratives for prophets or for biblical kind of protagonists. You think of Moses, for example, for how, for Isaiah, it is the tongue with the coal that touches his mouth, but also how Moses says to the Lord that, I am not good with words, that I am not eloquent. And then the Lord reassures Moses and says that it is my words that will be spoken through you. And yet there's a way in which, how is Isaiah's posture in this passage kind of juxtaposed with God's?
Definitely. I think Isaiah, perhaps much like any of us who found ourselves in the temple with the Lord there with flying seraphs around, he is awestruck. He is both overwhelmed by the holiness and majesty of the Lord and immediately humbled, right? He finds himself saying, Woe is me. These are the first words that we hear come out of his mouth, followed by I'm a person of unclean lips. So I think Isaiah, we know that he is the one, the prophet, whom God has called, right, to speak on the Lord's behalf, and yet his call begins definitely from a place of humility, from in need of to be cleansed.
I love that. Yeah, and there's this way in which I think, the passage starts off acknowledging the death of a king, right? So it says the first thing that happens in this passage, verse 1, is it says, in the year that King Uzziah died. And then it transitions immediately to this lofty picture of a God who is sat on the throne. And so I think in some ways, Isaiah is becoming God's subject. Isaiah is kind of acknowledging his own call to be the king's servant. But there's also a way in which, acknowledging King Uzziah's death, which places this scene, I think, about 740 BC or something like that. There's a way in which God's sovereignty, God's kingship, is almost positioned higher than the kingship of other kings, of earthly kings. Does that sound right?
Definitely. We know that Uzziah reigned for about 5 decades, a very long time, and yet sort of his death is just a mere phrase at the beginning of this passage. So there is this transition to recognize God's holiness. And holiness really just means set apart. So there is definitely this distinction between the Lord as the one whose holiness, whose majesty and glory provides protection beyond what military might is able to. And I think, though, like Isaiah, we might find ourselves overwhelmed by this scene, I think there's also this, for me, this grand sense of comfort that it is not upon sort of earthly rulers that we need to rely upon, but the Lord, who is depicted as the one enthroned.
Yeah, I love that. And but one thing that is very evident in this scene, and it's kind of quirky in some ways, is you have this seraph, this kind of angelic being that they surround God and they just sing hymns of praise to the divine. But one of those seraphs takes tongs and picks up a coal and almost kind of anoints Isaiah's mouth with this coal. And it's kind of a strange interaction. And what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's super weird.
Yeah.
I think one thing that strikes me is you have these holy beings. We think maybe they're like serpents with wings.
Yeah.
Sounds very trippy. But that they can't hold the coal. They have to use tongs, right?
Yeah.
But it's with these tongs that they, in a way, cleanse and purify Isaiah's mouth.
That's interesting.
And this follows, of course, from Isaiah saying, I have unclean lips. I am a man amongst a people of unclean lips.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because in some ways the tong and the coal, kind of operated by the seraph, almost prefigures how God will use Isaiah as an instrument of cleansing the people of Jerusalem, the people of Israel. So Isaiah in some ways becomes the tongs that pronounces the judgment, that's the coal.
Interesting.
To do away with the kind of the impurities of God's people.
Yeah.
But maybe let's shift focus a little bit here. There's so much we could talk about and ask, what is it that those people need cleansing from? That who is Isaiah sent to? And why is that important?
It's a great question. And I think this is where it's helpful to know that we did jump into chapter 6, but there are 5 chapters that precede this. And so I think reflecting on some of sort of the descriptions of idolatry, of injustice that the Lord's people are described as participating in might give us some insight onto what the judgment is that is coming.
Yeah, in some ways, maybe this goes back to it kind of has resonance with the kingly piece, the Uzziah piece that we talked about, We know from history that in that time, in the 8th century BC, that there was a lot of conflict in this particular part of the world. That the people of Israel were engaged with a lot of kind of military conquests, military engagements with other nations, that they were trying to be an expansive people to take over other nations. And so it's interesting that I think of how in Isaiah chapter 2, that God says about the Israelites, about those who live in Jerusalem, that they have kind of become intoxicated by the treasures of distant lands, that they have so valued kind of riches and valuable items that they have forgotten the poor and the needy in their own community. But what else is it about this community that maybe needs cleansing?
Well, I think perhaps Isaiah's own reaction to seeing the Lord enthroned is kind of the reaction that God's people need to cultivate, need to kind of to wear. That we have this sort of extreme example of humility, of kind of acknowledgement of Isaiah's own uncleanliness, own sort of creatureliness and dependence. I think in this moment we sort of see that there is a different kind of economy that's operating in this scene.
What do you mean exactly by that? A different kind of economy? Spell that out a little bit for us.
So I think Isaiah kind of gives us this example of dependence, of humility, that he unites himself with that same people to which he will be sent, those who are unclean. And yet there is sort of this new economy, one that kind of forgoes self-sufficiency or greed or the desire to kind of build up oneself or one's nation, but rather this kind of humble dependence on God.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And right acknowledgement of who God is, right?
Yeah. I think of how, so God later on in the book of Isaiah, when describing the Babylonian people, that great empire that will eventually come and take over Jerusalem, that God describes the Babylonians as being those who say in their hearts that they ascend to the heavens, that they will raise up even beyond the throne of the Almighty. That there are people that really has a lot of confidence in their own abilities, that they have a great amount of trust in their own technological and military kind of superiority. And yet God says that they're going to fall, that they will eventually fall. And I think there's something so profound about what you're saying, that in some ways the Israelites, they kind of have forgotten what it means to be a creature. They have so sought to be the master of their own lives that they've forgotten that they are, like Isaiah, the ones who are obedient. And so it feels like Isaiah is supposed to call them back to that obedience, to that creatureliness.
Yeah, there seems to be this unity in sort of their own humility and dependence. And yet at the same time, we know, because we call it the book of Isaiah, that there is something different and significant about Isaiah's role in this story, that he is a prophet. And so I'm curious about what exactly is a prophet?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because the word prophet, it's still a word that we use quite frequently in our vernacular as English speakers. And I think we probably assume that prophets are those people who, they tend to talk a lot about justice. Isaiah definitely talks a lot about justice. But I think they tend to be kind of angry people. They tend to be people who are kindled and kind of enraged by something. Do you think that's kind of a good depiction of how Isaiah depicts the prophet? Or how the book of Isaiah depicts the prophet?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a way in which the Lord's own proclamation of judgment and also of comfort and hope, that is sort of a very visceral proclamation. We frequently hear descriptions of the Lord throughout Scripture being called a jealous God, right? And so there's a way in which our conception of God at times and God's love and sort of commitment to the Lord's people is one that's very emotive, right?
It's so interesting. God is passionate. Yeah. How often do we think that God is kind of removed, abstract, is kind of passionless? One of my favorite, he might have been a prophet himself, a Jewish rabbi named Abraham Heschel wrote a brilliant book on the prophets. And he said this, he said that the prophet is one who has fellowship with the feelings of God, that a prophet is somebody who has fellowship with the feelings of God, and one who has sympathy with the divine pathos. I think that's really, pathos being passions or kind of these sentiments. And I think there's something so profound about that the prophet is the one who is most in tune with God's heart, of what God desires for the people.
It's interesting, even in the story, right? This live coal that is obviously too hot even for the seraph to hold, that is sort of the heat of this coal that is sort of that meets Isaiah's lips, right? That we know that there is something that's going to be potentially fiery about some of the judgment for which Isaiah proclaims, and that this sort of purifying, cleansing message is from the Lord. And yet we know that there is sort of hope and comfort, right? That we hear that Isaiah says, I have unclean lips, like I am unworthy. And then in that sort of posture of dependence, the Lord provides.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so and that's the kind of impossible task of the prophet in some ways, it seems. That the prophet, just like those tongs grip that coal because the seraph can't, that the prophet is the one who has been called to kind of hold those very fiery and in some cases uncomfortable pronouncements of God, who call the people of God back to holiness. I'm reminded how in the book of Hebrews later in the New Testament that it says that God's mercy is like an all-consuming fire. That God's fire isn't just to, burn completely, but rather to cleanse, to purify, to make new. And it's really beautiful.
To set apart God's people. To make them holy.
Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this introductory conversation on Isaiah 6, 1 through 8. I hope this might give you some food for thought as you enter into a conversation, whether you're doing this with a group or even just by yourself. We hope that you will enjoy the questions prepared for you, and please come back and join us for all 8 sections of this study together. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Have a
guys.
great time.